I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing efforts in Israel to create the next coalition government. I'm sure you know that in the March elections, the Likud party did far better than the polls and pundits had predicted, and Benjamin Netanyahu won 30 seats and has been given the opportunity to put together a governing coalition of 61 or more seats in the next Knesset government. But it's been a month since those elections, and thus far, Mr. Netanyahu has not been successful in forming a majority coalition. In fact, Israel's president, Reuven Rivlin, has now given Mr. Netanyahu an additional 2 weeks to see if he can be successful, but this is the only extension he can give to Mr. Netanyahu. Well, why has it been so difficult for Bibi to create a new governing coalition? And what are some of the major political figures saying and doing? Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, Moshe Kachlon, Avigdor Lieberman. And will Mr. Netanyahu be forced to do something he promised never to do? To create a unity government with Isaac Boogie Herzog's Zionist Union. And what about the ultra-religious party, Shas? What about the United Arab Party, which won 13 seats in this election? What are the obstacles standing in Mr. Netanyahu's way? And will he be able to navigate the way to a new coalition government? Or will President Rivlin have to turn to Isaac Herzog? Well, for some analysis and insight, we're pleased to be joined now from Jerusalem by Daniel Seaman, Jerusalem Bureau Chief of the Voice of Israel, with whom I'm very proud to say JBS will be partnering to bring you additional news coverage out of Israel. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, what's been the biggest obstacle that's been keeping Mr. Netanyahu from forming a new coalition government?
Oh, it would seem, as you were describing, that he's running into obstacles, but this is very natural for the Israeli political process. He needs all these parties on the right wing in order to create a coalition. Any one of them that is not there can drop him below the minimum that he needs, 61. So they're trying to position themselves to get the best deal that they can. And that means they're putting on him, trying to get him to make concessions in the process, meaning providing them with government positions, what we call the ministries, that they're interested in. And that's been the essence of it right now, him not wanting to give in and not wanting to be pressured, knowing that he has the additional 2 weeks, and always hovering above it all is something that you said correctly that he promised not to do, is the possibility of a national unity government. Now, I can say that for the first time, I would say in at least the last 25 years, this is the least wanted result, meaning the national unity. The public in Israel does not want a national unity. They give a clear mandate to the right wing to govern the state of Israel. Netanyahu realizes this, and therefore he also knows that the coalition partners, the partners that his potential partners, realize that there's pressure on them also to set up this government, because this is what the people want. So he has that working in his favor. Time is also on his favor. He has, with Kulanu, with Kachlon's party, and with Shas, and with the religious parties, an understanding. It's not an agreement yet. So basically all he needs right now is in the next 2 weeks to finalize with the Naftali Bennett's party and with Lieberman's party, and then he can reach the agreements with the parties. So
I understand. We
should probably see in the next 2 weeks, because as you said, he will not be able to give in another extension, and since it's clear that nobody else has the potential of creating a government, it could very well mean that we'll be going to new elections, but I don't see that happening.
That's interesting. You don't believe that Isaac Herzog, if he were given the opportunity, could put together a coalition of left-leaning parties and perhaps bringing in even the Arab Union, the union list of Arab parties? Could he, in that instance, get to the 61 benchmark?
Hypothetically, yes, but since they've made it very clear that they will not support any Zionist government in Israel, and the Zionist camp call themselves a Zionist camp, the former Labor Party, I don't see how they could say that they're not a Zionist party. No, there is no, mathematically, there is no way that Herzog can create a government, although, we know who the prophecy has been given to after the fall of the Second Temple. So I don't mean to, and politics is the art of the impossible. I don't want to say, but in all likelihood right now, Netanyahu will form this government since no other party can, on the right wing, can move away from what their voters expected them to do, which is to create a government under Likud and of the right-wing parties in Israel. So that's the technicalities of the Israeli system. You're trying to create a coalition to reach that magic number of 61 out of 120.
Okay. I find it very interesting that you say the Israeli people this time around do not favor a unity government, because in the past, a unity government has sort of been embraced by the Israeli people. Why now is it your sense, Dan, that no, the Israeli people do not want a unity government led by Netanyahu and Herzog together?
Well, for many reasons, but I think that what is clear here, in the past, the national unity government was necessary in order to address, if you want to say, the peace process, meaning realizing that in order to make the necessary concessions that were being required or requested of Israel, it was felt that it could go, a left-wing party cannot achieve peace, and they say in Israel, and a right-wing party can't go to war. It's very much like saying in the United States that only Richard Nixon could have gone to China. A Democrat president would have been frowned upon. The same thing, you have the same sensitivities here. So in order for a right-wing party to do this, or even the Labor Party, you needed both parties to go together, because it was clear to Israelis that we would need, risk would be necessary and concessions would be necessary on the Israeli side. Mm-hmm. But unlike 21 years ago, when the Oslo process was signed and the President of the United States beseeched us to take risks for peace, these risks today are no longer hypothetical or theoretical as they were then. Today, Israelis understand exactly what those risks are and are no longer willing to take those risks. All we have to do is look back 10 months ago to the last summer, when Israel came under attack from the Gaza Strip. Israelis are not willing to go through that anymore. And so it was quite clear that since the Labor Party continues to believe that the only way forward with our neighbors is making these dangerous concessions, the Israeli public is no longer willing to make those concessions, and therefore voted overwhelmingly for the right-wing parties and expecting them to withstand international pressure, which basically the international community expects Israel and puts the onus on Israel, when it's quite clear to two things here, and the Prime Minister said this often. One, there is no partner on the other side, meaning the Palestinians, though have been offered, and there have been overtures by Israel, even by this past government, have not responded, but instead expected international pressure to be applied to Israel, that Israel make concessions without the Palestinians needing to make any concession themselves, and therefore they're not willing to negotiate with the Likud government. And second is that even if they do negotiate, at the moment, knowing that they do not have a stable control over any territory conceded by Israel, and we saw this in the Gaza Strip, and with the added element now of ISIS, Israel making concessions to the Palestinians does not mean that they're going to be able to control these areas, and these areas could very quickly turn into launching pads for suicide attacks and missile attacks on the state of Israel. And right now, it is not the government of Israel, it is the people of Israel who refuse to have any concessions made to Palestinians, because it will not further peace, but instead be more dangerous for Israel. So until things are more clear on the Arab side, the Israeli public has chosen this time to remain pat, if you want to call it that way, withstand international condemnation, but, we can live with condemnation. Making concessions, as we've learned, can cost us our lives.
Okay. I want to explain to you what, from an American perspective, is sort of confusing, and if you can clear it up, you will. I'm not sure, sometimes confusions are something you simply have to live with. But there are two realities that seem to come out of the election, and you've addressed them in your answer to my last question. But I want to pose it to you this way. We were told over and over again that the most recent election, this last election in March, was not about Iran, was not about making peace with the Palestinians, that basically there is an overall consensus inside the State of Israel, a consensus that reflects the philosophy you just espoused, and that therefore the election was based on very different issues, most of which were domestic and financial. We were also told that if for some reason Herzog's Zionist Union did get more seats than Likud, that in fact Herzog was not going to change Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So that the issue of left and right wasn't about making concessions or making peace with the Palestinians or being willing to take risks. It was all about, this last election was all about, how do you move Israel further forward? And the other part of this, Daniel, that I want you to speak to is when you look at the way in which the vote was distributed, it is not that Israel voted more right than it had in the prior government. It's not that people voted suddenly and that Israel moved to the right. If you look at the distribution, the Likud party gained 12 seats to now have the 30 seats you talk about. But the reality is that Naftali Bennett, the Jewish Home Party, lost 4 seats. Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, lost 7 seats. That's already 11 seats that had been in the right prior to this election. And United Torah Judaism lost 1 seat. Well, there's your 12 seats. It's not that the right gained overall. It's that the distribution among the parties changed so that there was a concentration in Likud, but that the right did not gain at all in the overall picture, to use your word, the pie of the Israeli governmental breakdown. So that when you keep talking about Israel going right, it sounds to the American ear as if there were a larger vote for the right-wing parties, when in fact the vote is almost identical, except the distribution worked much better for Likud and therefore for Benjamin Netanyahu. And I want to know the extent to which you think I have it right, or am I missing something which would in some way support the notion that this election moved or saw the Israeli electorate moving to the right. I'm arguing with those who say the electorate did not move to the right. They just redistributed their votes. What do you say?
I mean, you're absolutely right. That's actually a brilliant analysis of the results here. Israel has been in that position for quite a while, but this time they felt that they had to, as I said, the person who has the largest number of seats would then be appointed by the president to get the first shot at creating the government. And the concern here was that since the left wing are consolidating around a single party, around the Labor Party, or as they call themselves this time around, the Zionist camp, it was a concern that he would be given the first shot and therefore would create a government that did not reflect the sentiment in the country itself. So you're absolutely right in that the issue, so the response on the right wing was to consolidate around the biggest party there, which was Likud this time. Mm-hmm. But there are two separate issues here that you're addressing. One is as you said, the distribution, which you're absolutely right. There wasn't a change in the attitude of Israelis. They basically say the way they have been in recent elections. I would say in the past perhaps 15 years. Mm-hmm. And they just consolidated to make sure that their preference gets to create the government.
Yes.
The other issue is what you were saying is that since that was all clear, that Israelis were more concentrating on domestic issues. That is basically the misinformation that was provided by those who were trying to undermine Netanyahu, saying to the public here, no, we don't have to address the bigger issues such as Iran or peace with the Palestinians or the international situation in the Middle East. They're trying to divert attention away from those concerns, which are legitimate and that we just dealt with this last summer, as I said, and try to say, no, the real problems are domestic. And in this case, they basically lied to the Israeli public, and this was a campaign conducted especially by Yediot Ahronot newspaper, lying to them, saying that the economic situation here is horrible, concentrating on the one real problem here, which is that of housing, that the housing here is very expensive in Israel. But since the elections, we've had several economic indicators come out. One of them, the growth of the economy in the last quarter of this year after the campaign in Gaza, which meaning after a war, Israel's economy rose by 7%, which is the highest in years and highest in the West. And that overall adds to the growth of 4% plus in Israel, which has been consistent. While the international community has had an economic crisis, Israel has been an island of stability, and this very much has to do with Netanyahu and his policies. So the Israeli public know that, all in all, their economic situation is very sound, very stable. The media tried to portray it in order to divert attention to them to vote for another party, meaning to sort of express dismay with Netanyahu. This was to lead them to create a party or to create a landslide against Netanyahu, which would lead to the Labor Party peace policies, which have been rejected by the public here, not because they're opposed to them or people are opposed to peace here, but because of the realities that we've had to deal with in recent years. So what you were referring to was basically part of the campaign that was orchestrated by the left wing and especially Yediot Ahronot newspaper, who are opposed to Netanyahu both economically and politically. And it didn't work because the Israeli public understand that the real issues still are the issues of defense, security, Iran, the threats that Israel's dealing with, and basically this summer, which sort of showed that the left wing in Israel, the Labor Party, the peace camp, have not been able to present an alternative to their policies, which they've been promoting now for 20 years, which have been proven to be, I don't want to say false, because everybody wants peace here. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the Palestinian side has rejected that and has manipulated the desire on the part of Israelis for peace and have used it to advance violence on the Israeli public, and the Israeli public are not willing to take that anymore. So, as you're saying, yes, you're absolutely right. The distribution was different. There was no real change in the attitudes of the Israeli public, but the economic things are secondary. The real things are the Israeli concerns, and therefore they responded by giving Netanyahu the absolute majority compared to other parties, if not the majority, because no party has ever gotten an absolute majority in Israel. But all in all, the electorate on the right wing made it very clear that they want Netanyahu to form the next government.
A fascinating analysis, very helpful, Daniel. All right, you mentioned this already. I want to make sure our audience understands. The issue in creating a coalition government for anybody like Mr. Netanyahu, who is trying to cobble together different parties to get to the magic number 61 or more, is that he has to offer plum ministries to the leaders of these other parties. And I want to ask you about a couple of people, and you just give me a sense of where things are going. Avigdor Lieberman was the foreign minister in the last government. There was at one point a feeling that Mr. Netanyahu was not going to give Mr. Lieberman that same position, and that made Lieberman very angry. My understanding is, Daniel, that Mr. Netanyahu now has offered the foreign ministry to Avigdor Lieberman, and that this will probably mean that he will get Yisrael Beiteinu's 6 seats. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. Then there is the issue of Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett, who heads the Home Party, has 8 seats, down 4 from the last Knesset. And Naftali Bennett wants to be Minister of Religion. At the same time, Aryeh Deri of the Shas Party, the ultra-Orthodox party that has 7 seats, he wants the Ministry of Religion. And at the moment, Naftali Bennett is holding out and saying that unless he's given the Ministry of Religion, he will not join the coalition. What's your analysis of that flap?
Oh, that's very complex. That's not as easy as the foreign ministry. I think that Naftali Bennett, who also wanted the foreign ministry, finally realized that the foreign ministry has basically been derived of all the important aspects of it, meaning relations with the United States, which is under the control of the prime minister, and a few other things. And the prime minister was satisfied with Lieberman's handling of it because he didn't bother him. Basically, he concentrated on developing relations, which is very important, by the way, and been neglected for many years, with the Far East, with China, Japan, India especially, and with African countries, which have now been proven to be a bonanza for Israel, because as Europeans are going back to their old ways of boycotting Jews, it now seems that it's really unimportant to Israel, because our second largest trading partner right now is the Far East. So Lieberman, we can give him credit with doing that. Naftali Bennett's requirement is a bit more complex because there's a competing requirement there, and that's by Shas. But I think the Prime Minister has the opportunity here. If I'm going to try to make an assessment here that is not an analysis. The last elections, Naftali Bennett joined hands with Yair Lapid in order to put pressure on the Prime Minister.
Yes.
It's one of the reasons that Yair Lapid was part of this government, and as Netanyahu sees it, the reason the last government lasted for only 2 years because it was very unstable because of the presence of Yair Lapid. And therefore, he still holds this against Naftali Bennett, and he's trying to teach him a lesson right now, especially since he lost a third of his strength in this time. So he's holding him on and letting him sweat a little. But I think, all in all, giving the Ministry of Interior to Shas is a big enough prize. They were out of the last government, so they're very eager to get back into the government and having access to special funding, etc., that the privileges of being the ruling coalition.
Yes.
So he can basically, and Netanyahu has been an artist at. He's been very artistic in finding ways of resolving these differences in the past when it was far more difficult for him, and he had to be creative in finding ways of creating a government in the past. This time he has a very clear majority, which gives him a lot of leeway. That's why I think also he wasn't too quick to sign any deals this time, and is letting the other parties sweat it out. I think he will resolve this. I think that he'll be able to beseech the parties and find some kind of compromise, and this will be resolved in the next, not this week because we're going into Memorial Day and Israel Independence Day, but I think that by this time next week we will have more or less an indication of how this is going to be resolved.
Are you predicting that Naftali Bennett will end up Minister of Religion or not?
It's hard to say. He could get what he's looking for within that, meaning responsibility for the conversions, for example, responsibility for other religious elements that could be taken away from, and this has been done in the past, when certain responsibilities under a particular ministry were taken away and given to others, or others, new ones created, such as the Ministry of Intelligence, which combined elements from the Ministry of Defense, the Prime Minister's office, etc., and brought it under the roof of a new ministry. So this could also happen. So I think that the things that Naftali Bennett is looking for, those responsibilities that come under the umbrella at the moment of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, could be, if not the ministry itself, those particular responsibilities could be transferred to his responsibility. And that will satisfy him.
Talk to me one more moment now about Moshe Kachlon and the Kulanu Party. Moshe Kachlon basically is known because he did this tremendous turnaround with cell phone costs in Israel, and his whole campaign is based on he wants to be in charge of housing, and he wants to be finance minister. But lo and behold, Shas also wants to be involved with housing, and evidently Netanyahu has given Shas the housing portion that would normally be part of the finance ministry, which we hear has enraged Kachlon and is keeping him from agreeing to be part of the coalition government. Give me your analysis of what you think can happen between Kachlon and Netanyahu, given the problem that Shas wants housing.
Oof, you're not making it easy on me. These are all assessments. I have to stress that. First off, regarding Kachlon, we have to remember that he was a minister under Netanyahu, and it was Netanyahu's policies, and basically he fulfilled the policies that were started by actually Eli Yishai, who was with Shas at the time. He's the one who initiated that, and then they changed the ministries. The ministers were changed, and Kachlon give him credit that he continued pursuing this, understanding the importance of it. So it came under his term. But Kachlon is a veteran minister or politician in Israel. He knows, he's very shrewd, he knows how these things work. That's why he's insisting on particular things. But at the same time, Netanyahu does not want to lose control and does want to not give any particular minister full control over these things. That's why he may spread it out. But again, these are not deal breakers. These are not things that are either going to make Shas not join or Netanyahu not give it to Kachlon. It's basically now more of a bazaar going on, a bizarre bazaar, basically trying to limit the concessions that he's going to make to keep things under his own control. And as I said, the people conducting these negotiations end up being very imaginative and creative, and we'll see these things being resolved by more or less this time next week.
In 30 seconds, give me some comment about Yair Lapid, who last time around was this rising star. He was able to win 11 seats for Yesh Atid, but there doesn't seem to be a place for him in this new government, and it seems like the star has fallen. What's your sense of where Yair Lapid will be going forward?
It's hard to say because it could be one of these, there's about 10% of the Israeli voters that each time vote for the party du jour, and he was the party du jour the last time. Will he continue? It's hard to say. He's a smart man, but he was also very much responsible for undermining Netanyahu, the last government, and the reason we went to early elections. And therefore, Netanyahu will not have him join this government and will not have him involved. And that's why he's going to be in the opposition. We see how he manages that. That could, on one hand, give him a lot of opportunity to work the field and provide, I would say, people more on the left wing. And by the way, a lot of this depends on how Netanyahu runs this government. If they do address the economic issues, there will be less reasons to oppose him next time. Mm-hmm. But he's shown to be very smart. He's a very good campaigner. He was more or less supposed to get half of the seats that he ended up getting this time. So he showed that being as a campaigner, he's very good. I wouldn't underestimate him.
All right. It sounds to me like if one had to bet, the best bet right now is that in the next 2 weeks, Benjamin Netanyahu will be successful in creating a coalition government of Likud, Kulanu with Moshe Kachlon, Jewish Home with Naftali Bennett, Shas with Aryeh Deri, Yisrael Beitenu with Avigdor Lieberman, and maybe United Torah Judaism, Yaakov Litzman. That would give him 67 seats. Daniel, is that the most likely outcome of the next 2 weeks on the Israeli political scene?
I would be absolutely surprised if that didn't happen.
Okay. It is wonderful to get your perspective. I appreciate the fact that you don't promise pie in the sky answers, and you say honestly, it's a very complicated picture, but you bring some real analysis to us, and I thank you very much for spending time with us on JBS.
Thank you.
You be well, Dan. Daniel Seaman, Jerusalem Bureau Chief of the Voice of Israel, who gives us a sense of where the coalition government is likely to be in the next 2 weeks. As always, my thanks to Director Sloan Copeland, Production Coordinator Serge Goldberg, JBS Associate Director Dara Golub, and the producers for this edition of In the News, Ron Jacobsohn and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.